Name. Amen. Paul's spiritual audit, and we read verses, we're going to look at verses 4 through 11, but verses 5 and 6, speaking about all of the credits in the credit column. He said that he was circumcised, verse 5, the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law of Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. Man was doing his end-of-year tax return, as I'm sure some of you will be doing, coming up to April time. Maybe you leave it to the end of the year, January, and you do the paper version. It's all a bit of a scramble. But a man was doing his end-of-year tax return, and the previous year, sadly, his wife had tried to start a hair salon in the house, but it hadn't really worked out. Things had gone well for a little while, the first few months, but really the startup costs were too high and it didn't really go, and so sadly it failed. It didn't go really before the end of the year. And the man was doing his return, and he tried to claim for his wife's salon from his expenses, and he submitted his return, and he was then called up on it by HMRC, and HMRC rightly, they said, "Sir, you can't do that." And he said, "Man, why not? The thing was a disaster. It was a total loss from start to finish." You know, in these verses, it's as if Paul is looking at his spiritual experience from the day of his conversion right up until this present day. And it's almost, as I've said, as if he's doing a spiritual audit. He's counting up the best blessings, the benefits in his life, and then he counts up the losses in his life. And again, he speaks of the gains in his life. Verse 7, "What things were gained to me, those I counted for loss." These things should have been a gain to him. They should have been a blessing to him. They should have been a benefit to him spiritually. But sadly, in verse 8, he had to use very, very expressive language. He counted them but dung. Why? That he might win, or as in the original, it really has the idea, he might gain Jesus Christ. In this chapter, Paul, of course, we have understood last week, he's warning the Philippian believers about infiltrating Judaizers. Verse 1, "My brethren, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you, to me it's not grievous, but for you it is safe." And so he tells them things they knew already. He told them in verse 2 that they were to beware of these Judaizers. Undoubtedly, they were trying to creep into the church, trying to infiltrate the church with their dogmas and their doctrines. And he told them to beware. And he told them that he was telling them things that they already knew. But it wasn't a grievous thing for him, because he knew it would make them safe. Verse 1, "For you it's safe." It's a safe thing that I remind you of the simplicity of the rudimentary elements of the gospel, so that as you remember these things, you're not tempted to listen to the Judaizers, to the concision, to the dogs that he speaks of in verse 2, and veer off and trust in works. And then we in verse 3, he, after telling them of the Judaizers and of their trusting in works and their attempts to infiltrate the church, he told them, verse 3, that they were to have a fresh relationship with Jesus Christ. In other words, he was saying, salvation's not a religion, verse 2. Salvation is a relationship with Jesus Christ. Verse 3, "For we are the circumcision," I explained that term to you, "which worship God in the Spirit, rejoice in Christ, and have no confidence in the flesh." We worship God not just in truth, but in the Spirit. We are the circumcision. We're spiritual Israel. Our hearts have been cut, as it were, mutilated, cut to pieces. We are the true Israel of God. And because we truly believe in Jesus Christ, then we worship God because of the fact we have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And remember, all of this is building up to verse 14, which we'll look at next week, Lord willing, where he tells them to press towards the mark for the prize of the high calling of God. But what does he tell them to do before they could press on? Verses 12 and 13, "Leave those things which are behind." Before they were to move forward, they had to leave certain things behind. They had to leave their Judaism, their rites, their roots, their religion behind. And that is why I believe very, very carefully Paul, in this section now, verses 4 through 11, takes time essentially to do this profit and loss, this spiritual profit and loss, and to tell them essentially what he was leaving behind. What he left behind on the Damascus Road in Acts 9, the day he came to know the Lord. That's essentially what he's doing, verses 4 through 11. He is telling them what he left behind, what he cast away. Why, verse 8? That he might win Jesus Christ, that he might press towards the mark, verse 14, of the prize of the high calling of God, that he might press on. So you see this here then. It's very interesting because in other books, in other epistles, Paul, if he's going to deal with a heresy, sometimes he will plumb the depths of a doctrine. You find that especially in the book of Galatians. The book of Galatians is a much more difficult book to understand than the book of Philippians. But remember, this is a church that's doctrinally sound already. I have mentioned that to you. I just highlight that to you again. So what does he do? Here, he adopts a different approach. He strips the gospel back to its basic elements. And he tells them what he counted but lost so that he might win Jesus Christ. That's what he's doing here. He's not plumbing the depths of great doctrines that they're already aware of, I believe. He's telling them his testimony. And it's very, very relevant because of what he would leave behind in order that he might press towards the mark of the prize of the high calling of God. And so he strips it all back to his past before Christ, his present in Christ, and his future with Christ. And he again does this. Why, verse 1? That they might be safe. This is a safe thing for him to do for the church at this particular time. And folks, if this was a safe thing for Paul to do, surely this is a safe thing for me to do this morning. See, sometimes it's good to take you on in doctrine and in the depths, and there's a time and a place for that, of course there is. But sometimes, for those especially of you this morning, I believe are still resting in right, in religion, resting in the things that Paul was resting in, sometimes it's just good to strip it all back to basics. Why? That your soul, verse 1, might be safe. That you might have safety for your soul this morning. If you're ever to know the prize of winning Jesus Christ, then you need to do this spiritual audit today. Don't wait until the tax man comes calling in a couple of months' time. Do it spiritually today, as Paul did. Because if you do this audit properly and thoroughly, do you know what you will find? It will be a safe thing, verse 1, for you. Because there are people here, and you're resting, not in Jesus Christ, but in other things. I need to realize, first of all, the futility of doing that. Then, like Paul, count it but loss, that you might win Jesus Christ, that you might, verse 11, attain to the resurrection of the dead, that you might be with him one day when he returns. So let's do this audit this morning. Let's take our pens and papers and crunch the numbers with Paul spiritually as we do this audit with him. The first thing, the first column I want to take you to in this spiritual audit is the credits in Paul's life. The credits in Paul's life. And we've read them already together. Verses 5 and 6. Circumcised the 8th day. What a list of credits. The stock of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law of Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is all in the law, blameless. Remember where we left Paul last week. He then continues verse 4 to speak of how, though I might also have confidence in the flesh. Last week he said, verse 3, I have no confidence in the flesh. But he makes a point in verse 4 to say that if there was anybody who could have confidence in their past, in what they were, in what they studied, in what they obeyed, it was him. Verse 4, if any other man thinketh that he hath reason for which he might trust in the flesh, I more. He makes it clear, if anybody could trust in works, if anybody could trust in right, and anybody could trust in ritual, he could. If anybody could have confidence in the flesh, here is the man, he could. And yet he doesn't. But before he counts them but loss, he has to speak of these things as a credit and things which should have been a blessing and a benefit to him. So he speaks here in terms of these credits of his parentage. He was circumcised, you see, the 8th day, verse 5, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, in Hebrew, of the Hebrews. Paul was a full-blooded Jew. That's what the first two clauses really are getting at here. He was no Gentile convert to Judaism. He wasn't a Jewish proselyte like the Greeks in John 12 who said, "Sirs, we must see Jesus," who were pagan converts to Judaism. No, this man was a pure-blooded, natural, national Jew. What does that mean? That means his parents could trace their lineage all the way back, not through Ishmael, but through Isaac to Abraham. Now that's key. Because you think of the nation of Edom in the Bible, in the Old Testament. They could trace their lineage back to Abraham, just like the Israelite, but they had to go via Ishmael. So they weren't full-blooded Jews. But that's what he means here when he says, verse 5, circumcised the 8th day, and Hebrew of the Hebrews. You see, the full-blooded Jew and the full-blooded Jewish male alone could be circumcised the 8th day. But rather the Ishmaelite, he had to wait to his 13th birthday in order to be circumcised. So here Paul, he counts up this first column. He was a pure Jewish boy, circumcised the 8th day. He could say, oh, there's some and they haven't had it done properly. They haven't had the proper rite or root of Judaism. But I have. And so it was his parentage. There was also his pedigree. Here he goes on to say he was of the tribe of Benjamin and Hebrew of the Hebrews. What was so special about being of the tribe of Benjamin? One of the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, the first king of Israel, King Saul, where was he from? He was from the tribe of Benjamin. He could trace things all the way back to the first king of Israel. That would have been a big thing. That would have been essentially like today, tracing your family tree in some way back to the king or the late queen. It would have been a very, very proud thing to have been a Benjamite. And another thing about being a Benjamite you find when you read through the Old Testament is that the tribe of Benjamin seemed to have a knack of churning out very decorated soldiers indeed. This was like the elite of the elite to be a Benjamite. There's a little reference in the book of Judges 20, verse 16, speaking about a group of Benjamite men, where we read, among this people there were 700 chosen men left-handed. Everyone, listen to it, could sling stones at a hairbreadth and not miss. Here were 700 left-handed Benjamite soldiers. And boys, they were talented with the old slingshot, weren't they? They could sling a stone and not miss. Saul was a Benjamite. Paul was a Benjamite. Now some of you, as you begin this audit, you can look to the credit column in your spiritual life, and perhaps you could say this concerning yourself as well. You have a great pedigree. You come from a good stock. You know what I mean by that. Your family are involved, your family are respected in the community, your family are involved in the work of God. Perhaps you can even trace your lineage back generations to maybe a grandfather, a grandmother, and they were well respected. They were godly individuals. They were God-fearing individuals. And as you begin to count up all of these credits, you feel because of your birth, because you were born into a certain family, certain circumstances, a certain church, that gives you merit or achievement or favor. And you base your whole spiritual experience on a shaky foundation. Paul spoke here of his pedigree and his parentage, but he also, verse 5, goes on to speak of his purity. As touching the law, a Pharisee. He was a member, you see, of religious aristocracy. He was a religious orthodox. He was a conservative. The word Pharisee literally means separated ones. Here was a group of individuals. There was about 6,000 of them, it's estimated, in Jesus' time, around biblical times and around the times of Christ. And they separated themselves, didn't they? They lived very strict, very moral, very upright lives. You read through Matthew 23 when Jesus denounced the religions of the Pharisees, and he speaks of them how they paid tithes of even little herbs that God had given to them that they had grown. They were so strict. Thousands of little add-ons to the law. Moral individuals. Remember the Lord Jesus Christ. How did he speak of their prayer life? He spoke of it in Matthew chapter 6, speaking in prayer. He spoke of the Pharisees praying in the corner, the street corner. These were individuals who prayed publicly. Here were individuals who not just prayed privately and were there and never missed a time of prayer. Here were individuals who prayed publicly and lived very, very strict lives. That's why you could say, verse 6, as touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. So he was a pure individual. In actual fact, he was blameless. This doesn't mean that Paul was sinless in his past, far from it. But he was blameless, and the word blameless, as I've highlighted in the past year, it has the idea that nobody could really point the finger. There was nothing outward, really, nothing glaring in his life. And maybe that's you. You're an outwardly, externally, morally upright individual. Maybe you're not perfect, obviously. But if you think of society, there's nothing really that stands out as a glaring black mark against your name, and you know what I mean by that. You come from good stock. You're morally pure. You seek to keep the Sabbath day. You seek to tithe like the old Pharisees. You try to take the Word of God, and you try to take the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, and you try to keep them. You try not to tell lies. You try to be good to your neighbour. And these things should be a credit. But they're not a credit when you're resting in them, my friend. Maybe you're like Paul and you have a pedigree and you have purity, but you also have a passion, verse 6, concerning zeal, persecuting the church. Here was a person who was zealous for his religion. Zealous. He was extremely passionate about Pharisaism. Extremely passionate. In actual fact, he was unrivaled. He was unequaled in his passion. When you read of him prior to his conversion, what do you read of him? You read of him persecuting believers. You remember the death of Stephen. What a terrible death it was in a sense, and yet what a glorious death it was, because his face shone as Christ bid him up and come up hither. But what do you read concerning Stephen's death? That Saul was consenting unto his death. Saul was agreeing with it. Saul was agreeing. He maybe wasn't part of it. He didn't throw a stone, perhaps. Remember, he was stoned to death. But you read of him actually there as a young man guarding the clothes. Guarding the clothes for the other individuals as they committed this cruel atrocity on a fine Christian man indeed, Stephen. Oh, boys, he was zealous for his religion. And maybe when you do this audit of your life, you can say that I have this credit as well. You're pure, you're a good provider, you're a good parent, a good person, a good husband, a good wife. Outwardly, your life is squeaky clean, spotless, without reproach. You know the right things to say, you know where to go and where not to go. You're moral, you're respectable. And as Paul had all of this, he places all of this in the credit column. These things should have been a blessing to him. His pedigree, his good upbringing, his zeal for the things of God. So it was the Old Testament law. And yet I take you back to what he says in verse 4. He has no confidence in the flesh. No confidence in these things whatsoever. And rather than having confidence in these things, you need to remove your confidence in these things. Because you're trusting in these things this morning for the salvation and safety of your soul. And I tell you this on the authority of verse 1, that's not a safe thing for you to do. Billy Sunday, the great professional baseball player turned evangelist, he said this: going to church faithfully and loving your neighbour and paying your tithes doesn't make you a Christian any more than being in a car being in a garage. it doesn't make you a Christian. It doesn't make you a Christian, my friend. It just doesn't. These things, they're good, they're helpful, but they don't make you a Christian. And so here Paul, in these first few verses, he spoke of the credits of his life. But also, I want you to see, secondly then, in this spiritual audit that he does, he spoke not merely of the credits, but he also spoke of the losses to Paul's spiritual life. Verses 7 and 8, what things were gained to me, those I counted loss for Christ. Yea, doubtless, I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ my Lord, whom I have suffered the loss of all things, to count them but dung, that I might win Christ. Paul, remember, is writing to defend the church against this attack of the Judaizers, or as he calls them, dogs in concision, in verse 2. And Paul is making the simple point here in verses 5 and 6 in this detail that in verse 4, if anybody could boast and anybody could trust in these things, him more. Him more so. But these things, whilst they should have been a gain to him, how did Paul view them? He takes them from the credit column and he places them now in the loss column. These things, verse 7, which should have been a gain to me, I counted loss for Christ. The word loss in verse 7, it's interesting. It means damage, it means an injury. You see what Paul's saying here? These things should have made me more safe. But the reality is they've been a damage, they've been dangerous to me. I had to count them as a loss. I had to count them as an injurious, as a dangerous thing for me spiritually, because I was trusting in them. The word counted here is, in verses 7 and 8, it's in the original text, it is an accounting term. The idea of the stock take, the idea of counting things, setting them in columns, adding them all up. So here's Paul, and it's right to call it a spiritual audit, because he's counting all these things. Should have been a blessing, but they ended up being a curse. So much so that he uses the very graphic language of verse 8. He counted it but dung. You need to be a Greek scholar to understand what he's talking about there. It is what it says it is. Refuse, that which is worthless. These things which should have been a blessing, should have been a gain, should have been a credit to him, he counted them as loss, as dung. He cast it all to the side. And my friend, rather than trusting in and falling before your privileges, you need to forsake them. Like Paul, count them but dung. Now, verses 5 and 6, we must concede that if you use these things, and as Paul wrote to Timothy, they make you wise to salvation, they're a good thing. A good upbringing, my friend, is a blessing. A spiritual upbringing is a blessing. Young people, children, it's a blessing to be raised by Christian parents. But it's only a blessing if you don't trust in them, but trust in their Christ or their Saviour. And if you're trusting in your mum or dad's salvation, your grandparents standing in the community, your whoever it might be, their influence in the work of God or the cause of Christ, if you're trusting in that, then you need to count it but dung. You need to realize that that's actually a danger to you, that that's actually hindering you, that is actually hurting you in your spiritual journey. Rather than looking at the righteousness inside yourself, you need to look to the one outside yourself. Look to the one that Paul speaks of here, the righteousness of God. The one that Martin Luther eventually looked to, not within, and not to all of his works, and all of his fastings, and all of his prayers. But as he came to that statement, Romans 1:16, the righteousness of God, the righteousness which was outside of himself, it's the same with you. It's God's righteousness, so it's perfect. And of course, it's provided by Jesus Christ. And that is what you need to look at and look to this morning. Not your own works, but the work of Him. The work of Christ. Now, in Romans chapter 2, Paul deals with this very issue, writing to the church at Rome. Remember, he's in Rome, but in Romans he's obviously writing to the church at Rome. Romans 2 is Paul dealing with the Jews trusting in their privileges, especially the first 6 to 8 verses. And he tells them that it was all futile. Because he said in Romans 2:17, "Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law." In other words, trustest in the law, "and makest thy boast of God." So he said of the Jews of the Old Testament, they were resting in the law, or the Jews, that were in his day, that they were resting in the Jewish privileges. They were resting in their supposed keeping of the law, and they were actually boasting of these things before God. Paul makes then a remarkable command to them then in verse 25 of Romans 2. Listen to this. "For circumcision verily profiteth, if thou keep the law. But if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision." So he said to them that their circumcision was a profit to them. What did he mean by that? Well, remember, it's a little bit like baptism. What is baptism? Baptism is a sign or a symbol. It does not change you. And circumcision for the Old Testament Jew was a sign or a seal of the fact that they were part of the covenant people of God. So the Jew could look at his external circumcision, that you could receive that right, but all the while, as we thought of last week, he had to have his heart circumcised. Spiritually, he still had to have his heart dealt with. Spiritually, he still had to be cleansed. What was circumcision? A picture of cleansing. What was circumcision? It was a picture of cutting off the old man and putting on the new man. So a Jew being circumcised did not make him a true Israelite, a believer in God. He just received the outward sign. And you see what Paul says here. He said your circumcision, if you used it in the right way, it would have been a blessing to you. If you looked at the outward sign and received the inward birth. But he goes on to say, Romans 2:25, but if you be a breaker of the law, your circumcision be uncircumcision. In other words, because you're not perfect, these things are not a blessing to you, and you need to cast them aside. Your circumcision, the privilege that you have received, it may as well be uncircumcision. It may as well be a pagan. That's what he's saying. Because you're not perfect, and you're trusting in an outward rite or an outward ritual. That's essentially what he's saying in Romans 2. They were trusting in outward rites. Let me be very clear here. That if you have received any form of sign or seal, that you are in the covenant people of God, that does not save you. Whether that be baptism or whether you've sat at the table. And whether that be as a child or as an adult. It doesn't matter. Those things do not save. If you're a Christian, you should be baptized. If you're a believer, you should sit at the table and show his death till he come. But I have seen people who have gone through the waters of baptism, and it's sadly they're not going on with God. I know of people who have sat at the table and they denounce their Christianity today. So what I'm saying is this, is that you can partake of these things, and you should. But at the same time, you don't trust in these things. You need to count these things but loss if you're trusting in them for salvation. If there's someone here trusting in the fact that you were baptized as a child, then you need to cast that aside, and you might have your heart circumcised. And look to Jesus Christ. What did Christ say in Luke 5? He said that those that are whole need not a physician, but those that are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. It's only those who realize their need before God. And you need to realize your need before God today. Spurgeon said, morality can keep a man out of jail, but it's only Christ that keeps a man out of hell. Morality can keep you from being punished by the law, the national, natural law. But it's only Christ that will redeem your soul. And so we thought about the credits and we thought about the losses. Lastly and quickly in this spiritual audit, look with me now at the gains in Paul's spiritual life. Verse 8, they start off, doubtless I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ. For I suffered loss of all things, count them but dung, that I might win Christ. Do you know what Paul's dealing with here? He's dealing with things, as I've said, they already know, but he has to show them this in order to progress. What he's dealing with is this. It's with the mentality that I fear sadly can creep into conservative evangelical churches today, especially in Ulster, where people rest in a salvation experience, where they rest in the fact that at such and such a date, I was saved. And look, it's good to have a date, don't get me wrong, but you don't rest in experience. Salvation is not an experience. Salvation, my friend, is a person, and it's a relationship with Jesus Christ. The question is not, were you saved 20 years ago? Can you remember the date? The question is, do you know him now? Have you known him? Now, I think this is amazing, because when you think of Paul's salvation experience, there was nobody who had a more dramatic, shall we say, salvation experience than the Apostle Paul. You think of how dramatic his salvation experience was. If we were to get him to come and to tell the events, he would fill this place tenfold. What would he say? He would say, I was on my road to Damascus from Jerusalem, and I wanted to kill Christians. I hated them. And then as I came near to Damascus, and he wasn't going crazy, but I heard a voice say, I looked up and I saw this blazing, glorious sight. It was brighter than the midday sun. And I heard a voice from this great blinding light saying, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? What an experience, my friend. He was blind for 3 days. Who here has been blind for 3 days after they were saved? Oh, boys, he could fill a place, couldn't he, if he majored on his experience of a day. But Paul doesn't even mention that here. He doesn't. What does he speak of? Verse 8, the excellency of the knowledge of Christ, my Lord. I want to know him now more. I know him, and I've got to know him. I have known this excellent one. Verse 9, one of my favorite statements in the Bible, and be found in him. Verse 10, that I might know him, the power of his resurrection, fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable to his death. Why, verse 11, if by any means I might attain to the resurrection of the dead. In other words, that I might be there. I know him here on earth, that I might one day be with him in glory, whenever Jesus returns and there is the resurrection of the just and the unjust. Oh, he wants to know him. He's not saying that the gains that he has was just one experience 20, 30, 40 years ago. He wants to know him. This is a bang up to date, personal, vibrant, vital experience with Jesus Christ. He's not trusting in past religion. His Christianity is not a religion to him, it's a relationship, that I might know him. And so I ask you today, what does your salvation look like? Be honest before God. As you do this spiritual audit, are you resting on a date 20, 30 years ago? Or can you say that your relationship is as fresh as the morning dew? That you've had time with him today, you'll have time with him today. That it's not just a religion, it's not just a bunch of religious exercises where you come and go from the house of the holy, but that you know him. And that you know his power and his blessing on your life. And you know him here on earth. So that verse 11, when there is the resurrection of the dead, that you'll be there. It's not that you're resting in some experience, but that you've progressed and that you know him. Because that's what it is to gain Christ. It's not just entrance to heaven. It's gaining him right now, this moment, this second. That I might know him. What did Daniel say? How did he describe his walk with God? Daniel 11, the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits for him, verse 32. You know him. And because of that, you do exploits. You don't do exploits, and through doing the exploits, you know him. It's through that relationship, that living, that vital relationship with him, that he enables you to do exploits for him. It's not because of what you do that you know him. It's not enough to know about him. You need to know him personally, not just academically. Do you realize today that in every other religion, You could follow that religion without ever meeting the follower or the author or the starter of that religion. You could be a Muslim today without ever meeting Muhammad. You could be a Mormon today without ever meeting Jesus or Joseph Smith. But you cannot be a Christian without knowing Jesus Christ. So do you know him today? George Truett was the pastor of First Baptist Church in Texas. And one day a cynic and a skeptic and an atheist came to him in the meeting afterwards and shook his hand at the door and said, "Dr. Truett, I want to ask you a question. I want you to tell me the truth. Is Christ real to you?" And the preacher said this. He said, "Christ is more real to me than the air that I breathe or the skin in my body. I know him." Is Christ real to you today? Do you know him? You count all of these things, but again, you know him, that's why. Paul's spiritual audit. May God bless these few remarks and thoughts this morning. I'm going to close by singing a couple of verses of a hymn, hymn 320. 320.